Thank you for inviting me to talk about eagles tonight. I've been fortunate to work on several different bald eagle projects in the Midwest, and the work is really fulfilling and exciting. And so this talk is kind of a combination of several different topics about bald eagles. I'm going to cover the DNR eagle surveys that we've conducted in the past and what their population is estimated to be at now. Go over some health issues and hazards, and then spend a little time on this Bio-Sentinel program. And that's kind of the... Okay, no problem. That's kind of the first part of the talk with all the wordy slides, and then the second half of the talk is more fun. It's just all pictures of eagle nests and stuff. So, yeah, I've been fascinated with raptors since I was a little kid, and my uncle was a falconer, and he introduced me to this lady, Fran Hammerstrom, who's a really important conservationist in Wisconsin. She did a lot of work with saving prairie chickens and researching harriers and kestrels. And so someone was doing a documentary on the Hammerstroms, and Fran wanted a little boy to climb up the ladder to the kestrel box and band the kestrels, and so I got that job. And then every year after that, like through high school and into college, I would stay with the Hammerstroms in their old farmhouse down near Plainfield and help with their research projects. And that's just a picture of Fran and her husband, Hammy, or Frederick Hammerstrom. And they were, if you didn't know, they were students of this guy on the left there. That's Aldo Leopold. So I always thought that was a really neat connection. So the first kind of topic is the bald eagle surveys that the DNR used to conduct. We had a long-running data set going back to 1973. Actually, we got some of that early data from a private citizen that lived in Waukesha. But then we continued this survey every year through 2018. And we split the state up into different sections, and we had a biologist or an ecologist cover each part of the state. We flew 2 flights every spring, one in late March to check and see which nests were occupied that year, and then we'd fly a second flight in mid-May to check on all the occupied or active nests, and we could actually at that time get low enough and count the number of chicks in each nest. And so that's an example of what you can see from the airplane. Typically in the spring there aren't any leaves on the deciduous trees yet, so it's a little bit easier to see into the oaks and the cottonwoods, and white pine are another tree that eagles nest in commonly, and it's more difficult to see into those nests. And the results of that data just show, probably not a surprise to anyone, but the number of occupied nests in Wisconsin increased every year. There was a little blip in 2014, but actually that was because we didn't finish all the surveys that year. So the most recent data that I have when we discontinued the survey was 2018. At that time, there were almost 1,700 eagle nests in Wisconsin. And so they've been, delisted federally since then. Okay, now I've got some slides that show common sources of mortality among bald eagles. And so our wildlife health lab did necropsies on over 500 eagles back in the early 2000s and attributed the cause of mortality to different categories, trauma being the most common, and the next slide will break that down into some subcategories. And then lead toxicity was tied for second with undetermined, some are electrocuted. But in terms of trauma, you can see that the leading cause of eagle deaths in that category were from vehicle collisions. And like I was talking to Sky a little bit earlier, it's really common for eagles to feed on roadkill raccoons or possums this time of year, or deer in the winter, and they just will eat and eat and eat so much that their crops get full and they get really heavy and they can't take off quickly. If there's a car that comes around the corner, over the hill, they often get hit by vehicles. Some were actually shot, some ran into power lines, some from fighting with other eagles, and a few more undetermined in that category. And so lead poisoning is a really important cause of mortality in eagles in Wisconsin. And these are the number of deaths due to lead poisoning in different months of the year. And so you can see it starts to really peak in November, December. You probably know that this end of November is when our 9-day firearm deer season happens, and there's a direct link there between deer that are shot with lead core bullets being left on the landscape or gutted, and there's some tiny lead fragments left in the gut pile. As well as some people, if they process their own deer, they'll take the carcass out into the field and put it out for scavengers and even for eagles to feed on. And what happens with these lead core bullets is that they fragment into hundreds of tiny little flecks and it almost appears like lead dust, we call it. So we did a study where we shot lead core bullets through ballistic wax, and you can see that all this kind of gray area is just that lead dust. And the alternative now, there are a lot of factory preloaded ammunition that you can buy that the bullets are solid copper and they don't have any lead in them. So California, I think, is for one state mandates solid copper, non-toxic shot for hunting. So yeah, just a tiny little bit of lead is enough to kill an eagle. So if you think of like a #4 bird shot that you might use for waterfowl or pheasant hunting, so a little tiny BB, if you were able to cut that up into 5 different pieces and feed one piece of that to an adult eagle, that would be enough to kill that bird. So they could easily be scavenging on something like a deer carcass and just unintentionally pick up a really small fleck of lead. As well, lead fishing tackle is often found in eagle nests. I'd say that about half of the nests that we visit have some form of lead tackle, whether it's split shot or jig heads. And again, there are alternatives on the market now. I think tungsten and maybe bismuth. There's other options for tackle that does not have lead in it. We've seen a few cases of other types of fishing lures being stuck in eaglets. So this is like I think it was a Rapala shad wrap or a crankbait that has 2 treble hooks on it. One of the hooks was stuck down in the eagle's leg, and the other one was actually stuck up in its bill. And so we just happened to be visiting that nest and were able to remove that lure from the eagle. Its bill was a little bit crossed after that, but we hope it probably made a good recovery. Another thing that can happen during the nesting season is eagles will reuse the same nest for many, many years in a row. And this was a nest in an aspen tree. I think it was in Grant County, kind of out in the middle of some farmland. And we had a windstorm, and the tree just wasn't strong enough. It blew over, and there were 2 eaglets in that nest that just died on impact. And then we had a similar thing happened in Richland County when I was flying the eagle surveys. We circled and circled and circled looking for this nest, and we couldn't find it, so we moved on. And then the landowner called me and said, hey, that eagle nest on my property blew over in the windstorm, and I'd like you to come and build them a new nest. And I said, oh, okay, that sounds fun. So this is Tim Tiller. He's a retired engineer, and he had picked out an oak tree near the creek, and he had all these tools and equipment and generators, and it was a really fun project. So we hauled up a bunch of like 2x6 decking material, got that in place first, and then hauled up bundles of sticks, and I kind of wove the nest together, and then lined it with grass, and then waited a few weeks, and then Tim said, oh, I hiked back on my property a little further, and I found that they're actually working on another nest. But as soon as they found my nest, they could see that it was far superior to the dam nest, and they've been raising eaglets there every year. I don't think you can see their house in this picture, but they're on this hill somewhere. So they have a good view right into the nest. Another thing that we see happening to eagle nest trees, this one was on the lower Wisconsin River this summer. Beavers, they'll girdle, all the way around the base of a tree, and then that tree's going to die, and that's kind of a close-up of what that tree looked like at the base. So when we were approaching this nest in the boat, I said, oh, it looks great, looks like a pretty straightforward tree to climb, and then we got up to it and saw that, and they would not be climbing. This was another nest in Crawford County. I think this is one of the first territories in Crawford County. Big old cottonwood tree. The eagles have been nesting in there for, I think, 15 or more years. And the beaver almost completely girdled the tree. And so I put some like hog wire on it and some like tree care liquid. And it's still doing okay. That tree is still alive, and they're still nesting in it. Okay, and then the Bio-Sentinel program. And by the way, if you have questions, just go ahead and blurt them out. Otherwise, we'll have some time for questions at the end too. But the Bio-Sentinel program is a really neat project where we're using blood from eaglets in nests to monitor contaminants in the environment. So rather than going out in the water and looking for legacy and emerging contaminants, we know that all the food that's in this water is going to end up right in here and then in the eagle's blood. So we can just take a small blood sample from the eagles and send that to the lab and tell exactly what kind of contaminants are in that area. Some of the early contaminants that we were looking at are DDT and PCBs. And so as you probably know, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the number of eagles in the US declined drastically due to reproductive failure caused by DDEs. When the eagles ingested DDE, it caused their eggshells to thin, and the weight of the incubating female would crush the eggs. DDT was banned in the early 1970s, and the eagle population rebounded throughout most of the range in the Midwest, except we noticed that populations along the Great Lakes shorelines were still depressed. And so, this slide's a little bit out of order, but why are we using eagles to monitor the health of the ecosystem? So we already have established monitoring programs on how eagle populations are doing. Eagles have a wide geographical presence, both in Wisconsin and throughout the U.S., wherever there's good habitat. We know that their reproduction is sensitive to contaminants, and they live and forage in aquatic habitats where different types of pollution is often concentrated, and so they've been proven useful as indicator species of ecosystem health. And then that data that we can get about ecosystem health is useful for a variety of agencies. So early on, like I said, we were looking primarily at DDT and PCB, and we were concerned with decreased eagle productivity in the Green Bay and Lower Fox River area, as well as the Lake Superior population. And then more recently, the project has expanded to other regions of Wisconsin and focusing on newer emerging contaminants, like PFAS are a big one. Technical.
Without a battery?
Oh, it could be.
Oh, it's just off.
Oh, I bumped it. Okay, thank you. All right, super. So the methodology for the Bio-Sentinel program is just that we need to collect a blood sample from the eaglets, and we have all the reproductive information based on the aerial surveys that we've done in the past. So we try to visit the nest when the chicks are about 5 to 8 weeks old, and that's when they're old enough to be fitted with a band and to collect a small blood sample from them. And we've now sampled eagles in different parts of Wisconsin. These dark purple dots up in the northern part of the state are the Lake Superior shoreline, and then we have the Apostle Islands, and going down the Wisconsin River, we kind of split that up into like the upper stretches of the Wisconsin River down to about the first paper mill. I think it's near Rhinelander. That's the upper Wisconsin River. The middle section of the Wisconsin River that has a number of dams and paper mills along it. And then the lower Wisconsin River below the last dam in Prairie du Sac. And then these orange dots are called the Northern Highlands Ecological Landscape. It's primarily Oneida and Vilas counties. And that's where, when our eagle population in Wisconsin was really constricted, that was about the only place that we had eagles still nesting in Wisconsin. And then we have the Fox River and Green Bay populations and the shores of Lake Michigan. So what did we find is getting into the blood of these eaglets. Starting out with some of the legacy contaminants, the ones that take forever to break down. DDT specifically
when that breaks down, there's a chemical called DDE that we can find in the eagle's blood. And we know that DDT was used quite a bit in Door County for the fruit orchards. So these are two different snapshots in time. I'm just going to stick this on here. So what we've got is we have dots for different eagle territories, and if we sampled the same nest multiple times, we have 3 dots for that nest. So we visited that nest 3 times during the period 1990 to 2002. And you can see this nest in Outagamie County was visited like 6 different times. Some of them were only able to visit 1 time. And then the color of the dots shows how much DDE we found in the blood samples, from white being no DDE to yellow being possibly a lethal concentration. Once you get up to 11 micrograms of DDE, that can be lethal. Orange, red, and black are certainly lethal concentrations of DDE. So this was early on in the study, pretty elevated levels in most places, not quite so high along the Fox River. And then this map on the right-hand side shows some of the same territories that we visited again in 2011 or 2012. And you can see that by then, there was much of the DDE was getting leached out of the system or no longer available to eagles. So a significant change over time. As I mentioned, that toxicity threshold range for eagles is about 11 micrograms, so that Green Bay and Lake Michigan population is kind of right on the verge of it. And the nests in Door County were all above that toxicity threshold. And then these are our other populations throughout the state: the Northern Highlands, Lower Wisconsin, Middle Wisconsin, Upper Wisconsin, and the Fox River nests. And then along the Fox River, we had they had their own problem with the paper mills, and paper mills dumping PCBs into the river. There was an estimated, I think, 350 tons of PCBs dumped into the Fox River that resulted in degraded fish and wildlife habitat, impaired avian reproduction, and still fish consumption advisories in some areas. And then the same kinds of maps with PCB. So going back to that 12-year time period from 1990 to 2002, so elevated levels of PCBs along the lower Fox River, and this Brown County 01 is right near the mouth of the Fox River. And then fast forward to 2011 to 2012, the levels of PCBs had declined drastically on the Fox River above the dam in De Pere. And that's because in the intervening time, they had done a lot of remediation, dredging, and cleanup of the sediment in the Fox River. And so that got the PCBs out of the system for those birds, but still elevated levels out in Green Bay. And then looking at total PCBs throughout different parts of the state, Green Bay and Lake Michigan populations at or close to that critical threshold. The lower Fox higher than it, and the other populations we just don't find PCBs in. They're not critical levels. Okay, and then these are 2 slides showing just overall success. So this was back in 1993. There were only 5 active nests in the study area. This one in Outagamie County fledged at least 1 chick, and so that got a green dot that year. These other 4 nests didn't fledge any chicks, so those nests failed completely. And then if you fast forward to 2012, you see that there are a lot more eagle nests in the study area, and a lot of them were successful. Still a few were not successful, but overall much improved reproductive success. Mercury is another one that we're looking at. That kind of naturally occurs in shallow water flowages when those areas are flooded, and it has something to do with the trees decaying. So we did have in shallow flowages elevated levels of mercury. And then this one nest in Oneida County, that's one individual nest, for some reason had high levels of mercury. And then this is just like a stacked chart of overall contaminants. So down in the bottom would be DDE, would be the blue section of the bar. Red is polybrominated compounds, one of the emerging contaminants, and then total PCBs are yellow or green. And PFAS now, I'll talk about that group of chemicals next, is contributing a huge load to eagles in the middle stretches of the Wisconsin River and the lower Wisconsin River, as well as other parts of the state too. And part of the reason we think for these really high levels of PFAS in particular in the middle and lower Wisconsin River isn't necessarily associated with like one point source like a factory along the river, but rather just that the Wisconsin River drains such a big watershed. You think of all the tributaries to the Wisconsin River, that these chemicals are just ending up, they're sloughing off of our clothing, I don't know, food wrappers, I'm not sure exactly the mechanism. I do know some of them. I'll talk about some particular compounds in a minute here. Okay, so again, the PCBs, when they cleaned up the Fox River, the PCB levels decreased in those eagle nests. However, emerging contaminants, especially per and polyfluorinated compounds, are increasing, and we need to figure out more specifically how those are impacting eagles and other wildlife species. So kind of the end of that field work wrapped up in 2014. We sampled nests in Oneida and Vilas County and Lake Superior. In 2015, we sampled nests along the Wisconsin River, starting down at Prairie du Chien and working our way up as far north as we could. In 2016, we were back at Fox River, Green Bay. 2017, back to the Northern Highlands, and then I started working with Natural Resources Foundation field trips in 2017, and that's about the same time that the DNR went through a big realignment, and we lost our wildlife toxicologist. The wildlife program couldn't work with non-game species anymore, so it kind of, our whole project kind of went on a hiatus for a little while there. And I did some work with some colleagues with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Iowa. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we had COVID. Nobody was out in the field for a few years then. And then in 2022, we kind of got the band back together just to kind of knock the dust off, and we sampled a few nests in the Northern Highlands and helped out on some NRF field trips. And then we got some new researchers associated with the project. Gavin Daynard and Emily Roos. Emily from the Field Museum and Gavin with the Sea Grant Institute, UW-Madison. And so they're focusing, like I said, more on these emerging contaminants, different types of PFAS in particular, and how those affect eagles and other wildlife species' health. And so they've got a focus now on, in 2023, we sampled nests along Lake Superior and the Apostle Islands, and then I did some work with a colleague putting radio transmitters on eagles in Kansas and Missouri. In 2024, we were back at Lake Michigan, Lake Superior and the Apostles. This past summer, we did the Wisconsin River again, and then next summer, we're going to do the Mississippi River, and then the St. Croix, and so on. So they've got some good funding from NOAA, I think, is one of their main funding sources. So this is Emily and Gavin, and we're real happy to have them on the team and kind of driving our research interests. And so like I said, they're focused primarily on PFAS, which are per and polyfluorinated compounds. There are hundreds of different individual compounds of PFAS, and I don't know what they all are, exactly how they affect eagles, but that's what they're diving into. And so some of the work they did was molecular sexing of eagles to compare whether our measurements in the field to determine male or female were correct, and it turns out they were. And then they're looking at white blood cell counts, and these things complement lysis and immunobody responses. So they're the brains of the program now. They've got a paper out already. It was published in Environmental Research in 2025. Some of their preliminary data, and full disclosure, I don't know what all this stuff means. They just take me out in the woods and they say, here's a tree, Dan, why don't you climb up there and see if you can get us some eagles. So I thought the graphs were pretty interesting though, but these are different types of PFAS compounds. And increasing levels of PFAS leads to decreasing white blood cells in the nestlings. And different, there's PFDA, PFDOA, I'm not sure where those are all from. I know PFOS are common in different types of flame-resistant and retardant compounds. A lot of these have to do with like flame-resistant or stain-resistant compounds. complement lysis ability, I don't know what that is. Natural antibodies, this is all bad stuff that happens when your PFAS levels increases. So one kind of PFAS that are kind of near and dear to me, these are different types of ski wax that I had in my wax box. I did a lot of ski racing when I was younger, and now I have a junior Nordic team, and we travel around the state and race, and they outlawed all fluorinated waxes about 3 or 4 years ago. And so like some of these are a powdered compound that costs like $200 for a little vial of this stuff. It is loaded with PFAS. They make your skis repel moisture, and they make your skis very fast and slippery. And so there have been some really neat papers done in Norway and also out east, I think in Vermont, looking at the effects of just that type of wax wearing off of people's cross-country skis at racing venues and getting picked up by worms and small mammals and even ending up in eagles. So I would like to sample some nests near the Birkebeiner Trail up on the Namakogan River, and I'm sure I've contributed PFAS to that water source. But anyhow, so these are some different types of PFAS. The big tall green lines are PFNA. I don't know exactly what that is, but we found a lot of them in Lake Superior shoreline and the Apostle Islands, and then the other populations, it wasn't quite as prominent. I don't know what that is or where it comes from even. And then PFOS, these are some other stain and water repellent chemicals that were used to treat clothing. So like I have this rain jacket from Kuyu, I know that's got PFOS on it, and every time I wear that through the woods, that stuff is sloughing off. So it's kind of ironic, that a lot of the outdoors people, myself included, buy this high-end stuff, and it's just got bad chemicals on it. PFOS are really high in the middle Wisconsin and the lower Wisconsin River. Okay, and then what does this do to eagles? We know for sure that it has a negative impact on endocrines, and that can impact their thyroid function. It can decrease reproductive success, hatching success, affect nesting behavior. This guy's probably on PFAS, you can tell by his posture there. And immunotoxicity, just how are their immune systems affected? So if they have elevated levels of PFAS and then they're exposed to, say, avian influenza, do they have a higher likelihood of contracting that and succumbing to it? Okay, so in summary, PFAS, some form of PFAS were detected in every bald eagle population that we sampled. Most of the populations are below current thresholds for PFOS, but individuals might be above it in certain areas. Thresholds for other PFAS are not well established or not established at all. And so again, just using blood from an eagle to tell us about how healthy the ecosystem is and how the health of that ecosystem changes over time. And the big take-home point, this was Sean Strom, our main researcher, really tries to set this home with everybody, is that those eagles are eating the same fish and the same deer and the same everything that I'm eating, and probably a lot of you people are eating too. Some of the emerging contaminants, and I don't know what all these compounds are or what they do, but these are some of the ones on Sean's list that he's looking for. So, all right, now pictures. This is the good part. So just some different processing eaglets, how we work them up in the field, how they age or develop over time in the nest, some of the food items that we found in the nests, and then some differences between trees and how their nests are built. So we start out, when we're in the field, we have a GPS location of where the nest is. A lot of these nests we've been to, once every 3 or 4 years. But we navigate in most of the places in the state. We're using boats, not all of them, but we navigate to it, and then you can see the nest from a distance. We haul all of the gear onto shore, and then there's 2 different ways that we can climb trees. The probably the most common and straightforward way is just to use a set of climbing spurs on your feet, and then you've got a harness and 2. We call them lanyards that go around the trunk of the tree, and so you just flip that up and take a few steps and flip it up until you get to the first big limb or obstruction in the tree, and then you take your second lanyard and throw that around a higher limb or the trunk above that one, and then detach the first one and just keep climbing up the tree. It's a lot of gear, and then we're also dragging up like 200 feet of rope because some of the nests are 100 feet or more up in the tree, and we've got to be able to lower the eagle down to the ground to get it processed, and then so you need 200 feet of rope. Pretty much does it most of the time. And then the other system that we use for climbing trees, sometimes it'll be just like poison ivy vines all around the trunk of the tree, and I'm real reactive to poison ivy. So like an arborist technique is we can shoot a throw bag or a throw weight with a fine line attached to it up and through a high crotch in the tree. So I've got like an air-powered gun, like a potato gun, and I put the throw weight in there, and shoots it up through the crotch of the tree, and it falls down, and then we tie our climbing rope to it, and we pull the rope up and through that crotch, and tie the rope off on the trunk of the tree. And then with some other climbing gear, we climb up the rope and get pretty close to the nest. We've been back to the same nests every 3 years to a lot of the same trees throughout the state, and we don't see any damage to the trees from those spurs. We've never seen a tree get unhealthy or die from it. And I have a big, huge cottonwood in my backyard, and every spring I climb that thing like 15 or 20 times, and they just heal right up. So not a big concern. Sometimes there's obstacles along the way. I don't remember where this nest was, but there was this porcupine just hanging out right below the eagle nest. And so I just kind of pivoted around to the back of the tree and climbed up past him, and he didn't seem to mind. But we always, you check like for the health of the tree, make sure that there isn't any rot, or sometimes they're hit by lightning. You don't want a hornet nest in the tree, stuff like that. And then I usually just climb up the tree high enough so that my chest is about the same height as the top of the nest. And these nests are almost always pretty much flat across the top. Like a lot of people think that they might be cupped like a robin's nest, but they're not. They're pretty much flat across the top. And the female will choose one small area within that nest surface to make a little nest bowl, and that's where she lays and incubates the eggs. So there's a lot of coarse wood sticks on the outside, a lot of finer materials on the inside. So they get really heavy. You can imagine, hundreds of pounds, I'm sure. I was going to say something else about the nest, but now I can't. I'll just keep going. So if I get to the nest and the chicks are small enough that I can just easily pick them up, I can do that, but oftentimes those nests are 5 or 6 or 7 feet across, and I just can't physically reach all the way across the nest. So then we have these chicken hooks, we call them. It's just a tripod leg. I bought a fancy camera tripod and broke it into 3 parts, and then I can grab your drink or whatever I need when I'm up there, but they have a bent hook on the end of it.
So Dan,
Yeah.
what are mom and dad eagles doing when you're...
Yeah, good question. So every raptor species reacts a little bit differently to a threat at the nest, and eagles are on the really laid-back side of things. And I think it's because, my suspicion is that because they're just such big, bulky birds, they're not built for really quick maneuvering at the nest. So other species like kestrels, peregrine falcons, even goshawks are really agile at flying through the woods and dive bombing people or predators at the nest. But the parents, oftentimes they're out foraging at the time that we get to the nest and start climbing, and sometimes I'll be in the nest and they'll fly back to the nest area and they'll see me in the nest and they'll just circle around a few times and kind of scold me, and then they usually will perch nearby and just keep an eye on things, and then once we're done and back on the ground and leave the area, they're always back at the nest within like half an hour. So there's no like sense of smell, they don't seem to be upset by it. We haven't had any nest failures that we know of after we visited nests, at least not because of our presence there.
So why are you not wearing protective gloves and things? I've noticed in a lot of pictures you're holding an eagle with nothing on your arms.
Protective for me or for the eagle?
For you, I see what their beaks look like.
Yeah, so I do, when I climb the tree, I wear some leather gloves, and then when I get up to the nest, I like to take my gloves off so that I have a better feel with my hand of what I'm doing. And they'll use their feet, and they'll use your beaks, and they'll scratch you up, but they're not, I like to be able to have good sensation in my hands. When we had a lot of avian influenza in the state, I think it was 2022 and 23, then we took precautions to protect the birds, and so we wore masks up at the nest. We changed our shirts from one nest to another one. We changed our gloves. We had bags that we put the eagles in, and we had to use a fresh bag for every eagle. So these are the size of bags that we used. My mom sewed a couple up for me, and then she retired from sewing, so I had to learn how to sew. But yeah, that's big enough to hold all the eaglets that we catch. So I get up to the nest, and like I said, if they're small chicks, and I can just kind of pick them up and set them in the bag, and then I close it up, clip it onto my rope, and send it down to the ground. Or if they're bigger chicks and kind of spicy, then I can't reach across the nest, so that I just need the length of this to get over to them, and I'll just hook the leg gently that's further away from me and kind of coax it toward me a little bit. Sometimes they'll turn around, and then I hook the other leg and coax it a little closer until I can get my hand on their feet, and then I bring them closer to me, and then bring the bag up over the top of them usually, and get them all situated in the bag and set it up. And so usually I don't go in the nest itself. I try to stay out of the nest, but on rare occasion I just can't get comfortable or be safe outside of the nest. So sometimes we just kind of sit right up on the edge of the nest. This was a picture that a colleague took of me. She was flying those eagle surveys in Lower Wisconsin River, and I was just up at the nest, and there's one chick there. And it was pretty windy, and the tree was blowing back and forth that day, but I was roped in. I felt great. And then I looked across at the airplane going by, and the airplane was going up and down like this, and that almost made me sick. So I'd much rather be in the tree. And then, like I said, I get the eagle in a bag and lower it down to the ground. Sometimes, it's kind of hard on the real branchy trees to find a nice straight line, but eventually we get them down. And then on the ground, they're, I think, taking a blood sample here. They have a really fine gauge needle that they use in the brachial vein of the eagle. And then they get an aluminum Fish and Wildlife Service band that's riveted onto their, I think it's the left foot. Mike is taking a feather sample for mercury analysis. We measure the length of the foot pad, and then based on their age, which we determine by measuring one of the primaries, the eaglets with bigger feet are the females, and the eaglets with smaller feet are the males. A lot of raptors are sexually dimorphic. The females are bigger than the males, and eagles are in that same category.
So are you hanging out in the tree the whole time?
Yeah,
yeah. You're waiting.
Yeah, good question. So yeah, I get comfortable as I can, and I'll kind of carefully sift through the nest material and see if I can find, sometimes there's an unhatched egg, kind of that gets buried in the nest material. That's not very common, but they can lay up to 3 eggs. Usually they all hatch. 2 is probably most common, but 3 is also not that uncommon. So I look through the nest litter a little bit for an unhatched egg, and then I kind of take some notes on prey items in the nest. And recently Emily and Gavin are interested in getting a little bit of tissue from the prey items so that I think they can kind of correlate it to those exact contaminants that the eagles are exposed to. So I'll take like a little snippet of fish and put it in a vial. But yeah, I might be hanging out up there for, if there's 3 chicks, it might be like an hour or more. But it's a really fun place to be. I mean, it's really, the view is fantastic. I really enjoy it. Yeah. So eagles, we were just talking earlier. The female lays an egg, and then typically, she will start to incubate that first egg, and the next egg comes in 2 or 3 days. And so the first egg that's laid is starting to develop already before she lays the second one. and then she'll wait 2 or 3 days until she lays the third one. And so there's usually at least 2 to 3 days difference in age because that first one develops faster and hatches first. Okay. So these guys, so we try to visit the nest. When we had good data from the plane, you know, we could tell about how old the chicks were from the plane. We try to visit the nest when they're about 5 to 8 weeks old. These guys are too young to take a blood sample from. I think that we may have banded, even when they're this small, that you can't even put a band on them safely. It might slip off. But at this stage, they're mostly like this gray, downy feathers. This is really cute when they have this kind of white stuff on top of their head. Their flight feathers aren't even coming out of the shaft yet, and they're full of blood. Those shafts of the flight feathers are, you know, the wings are really heavy. They're not very coordinated. They can walk around. They can stand up a little bit. But that's really cute, but it's not quite big enough for our research needs. When they get a little bit bigger, they just, you know, they can stand a little bit more. You can kind of start to see a little bit of some brown feathers coming in here on their body and also on their wings as they get a little bit older. These guys are probably around the 38 to 40 days, strong enough to stand up a little bit more, but still have to be really careful with all those blood quills that you don't damage the feathers when you're handling them. And then this was a kind of really interesting nest in the Old Plain Reservoir. Just a big apparent range. You know, this one looks a lot younger. This was probably the oldest one in the nest, and this one's kind of in the middle. So I don't know, you know, what the phenology was on that, but we just kind of, everybody on the project took a guess on how old those chicks were, and that's what we came up with. When they get even older, of course, they're standing and walking around more, maybe starting to flap their wings a little bit. How many eagles are in this nest? 3? Yeah, right there. Somebody's foot is down there, so somebody's hiding behind that guy. And then this was a nest on Lake Superior that we had to hike like way back through the marsh and cross a beaver pond, and we finally got to the edge of the lake. There was this big steep hillside, and we were high enough that we could look directly across pretty much at the nest. But we had to climb down this steep, slippery bank and then climb, you know, way up the pine tree. And they were a little bit older than I really wanted. And when they get to this age, they might start walking out on the branches a little bit. And one of these guys actually walked out onto this stick that was kind of suspended between 2 branches and was just like wobbling back and forth. And so I got my chicken hook around that bird and got him in a bag quickly.
Which one was it?
Probably the older one. I can't remember for sure. But the folks that I work with are so dedicated that if one of them had fallen or jumped out of the nest, I mean, they would have run down to the lake and stripped naked and swam out in the lake and got them. So we haven't ever lost one or had an injury or anything. These are, you know, quite a bit bigger, starting to be at the risk of fledging possibly, sometime around 10 to 12 weeks of age. They can fledge. And this one actually did jump from the nest. We tried to avoid it, but we didn't have a look at how old this chick was when we approached the nest. And I was about halfway up the tree, and it just bailed out of the nest. But it's okay. They set their wings, and they just kind of soar down to the ground and land in the grass. Once we had one jump and land in the river, they got the boat in and netted it quickly. Everything was okay. So once they do that kind of exciting jump, and then they catch them on the ground, and then they have them already, and they take a blood sample and band them and measure them and weigh them, and then haul them up to the tree, and by then they're a little bit more relaxed. They've had a big adventure that day. Okay, in terms of food, eagles, you know, are really built for catching fish. So the fish species that we find in the nests are often what's most common in that area. So the shallow water flowages, like the Old Plain Reservoir, other parts of the state too, we see a lot of northern pike. This is a nest in the turtle flambeau flowage, so a variety of fish, northern pike, bullheads. Strangely, we find some bullheads in some of the eagle nests, and smallmouth bass. And this was a nest on the lower Wisconsin River near Spring Green that had a red horse, a smallmouth. I mean, these are like fresh fish. Red horse, smallmouth, soft-shelled turtle, I think there was a raccoon, part of a raccoon, crow, amazing. So kind of surf and turf in that nest. Then up by Lake Superior, we find whitefish sometimes. These are, I think, are walleye. And then this is, they call them a lawyer. An eel pout, I think, is another name. And they're really deep water fish. I don't know how they caught it.
Do they ever eat the fish that are spoiled, or do they really only want the fresh?
You know, I don't know. I mean, sometimes they get kind of nasty and kind of flies and bugs and stuff, and I think they would probably eat that before they starve. I'm not sure. I'm kind of putting.
Building up a store on their nest, just adding to.
Yeah, some parents are really good hunters, and there's a lot of fresh food in the nest, and then sometimes, maybe it's not the parents' fault, maybe it's just scarcity of food on the landscape, but some nests have very little fresh food in them. And we always take a measure of how full their crops are, and some of them, you know, don't have much food in them, some of them just have these big full crops, and they're just like lethargic. So I think, you know, it's partly an indicator of how productive the immediate resource is. So like along the Mississippi River, we have eagle nests every half mile or closer. You know, it's just such a productive ecosystem. So we find walleye, bluegill, northerns. I was just guessing this might be a muskellunge jaw. I'm not sure. They're huge northern pike or muskellunge. Does anybody know their fish jaws in here? We'll call them muskie. Yeah, and they have to watch out for nest parasites when the whitefish is so fresh. I mean, I've been tempted. I didn't actually steal from them. This was a nest, I can't remember where this, yeah, but so someone had caught some walleye and filleted them and thrown the carcasses out, probably knowing that there was an eagle nest nearby, I'm guessing. And so they had one of those that was caught by a fisherman, and then I think the eagles caught those other walleye themselves. Anybody know what this fish is? Gar. Gar, yeah. I know, it's probably long-nosed gar. So you see a lot of that in the lower Wisconsin River. You might have guessed by now that when I'm sitting up at the nest waiting for them to, sometimes I get kind of artistic with it. But I always put things back where I found them before I leave. But I just couldn't resist kind of setting that up. And then this is a bowfin. You find those in the lower Wisconsin River. And these gar, interestingly, they have such tough skin and scales. It's like armor. And so sometimes there will be kind of like a little hole here where they were able to rip it open a little bit, and I think they stick their heads in there and suck out as much as they can, and there's just kind of these petrified hulls remaining. More bowfin and carp. There's a big mammal here. I know. Any guesses on that skull? This guy. Opossum. Yep, they have the smallest brain case per pound of live weight, so it had just this little walnut-sized brain cavity, so I know that's a opossum skull. You know, whether they caught the opossum live, they probably could have, because they're kind of slow, or oftentimes I think it's roadkill that they're bringing up to the nest. This was on the Wisconsin River near Whiting, near a dam, and this is all like bunny rabbit fur, and then black squirrel. So black squirrels are just gray squirrels. They're more common in urban environments, typically, I believe. We don't find too many red squirrels, and yeah, again, this isn't really a natural setting. Up on the turtle flammable flowage, there's this fresh red squirrel in the nest, and these are all northern pikeheads, and they kind of look like the pike were attacking the squirrel. I put it back, put everything back before I left. I couldn't resist. But that Chuck brought in a book. It was written by Jeff Wilson, who's a retired DNR wildlife technician, and Jeff was up there on this trip, and afterwards I said, how do you think they caught a red squirrel? And he said, well, I've seen them swimming from the mainland to an island, red squirrels swimming across the water, so that's just easy picking for a bald eagle. And this was a nest near Tomahawk along the Wisconsin River, and had probably a turkey, parts of a turkey that had been hit by a vehicle, I believe, smallmouth bass. There was a bunch of interesting stuff in here, red horse, and then there was this old pop can, and I was like, what in the heck why is there a soda can in here? And I couldn't figure it out, so I took a big whiff of it, and I almost like barfed. It smelled so bad. So I looked in there, and there were at least 1 or 2 dead crayfish in there that had been sitting out in the sun. And so I don't know. My best guess is that maybe that can was down on the bottom in shallow water, and maybe an eagle was like sitting nearby and saw the crayfish go in there and picked it up. I don't know why else. We did find a diaper, a soiled diaper once in an eagle nest near a landfill out in Union County. But so anyhow, rotten crayfish in there, so I put it in the bag and sent it down for the ground crew to investigate. They like that. And then, well, I've got a few pictures from work I've done in Iowa. They are just into a whole different food list in Iowa. Like this was a pigeon in a nest near a cemetery, a little fox squirrel, tail fur, maybe a pheasant, I think a carp, ducks. So just a real weird variety of stuff. Another nest in Iowa. These are actually fawn remains here, probably roadkill again. Eagles can lift about half of their weight under the most perfect situation. So an adult male bald eagle weighs about 7 pounds in Wisconsin. An adult female weighs about 9 pounds. So under the perfect conditions, they could lift half of that, so 3.5 or 4.5 pounds. So something like a fawn probably weighs 4 to 8 pounds, 4 to 7 pounds at birth. But if it's already kind of partly broken up on the side of the road, or if they can rip some chunks off of it and bring it to the nest, they will. These were some, I don't remember, some kind of heron maybe. I thought I figured it out at one point, then I forgot. Yeah, just a variety of different, bird remains, really unusual stuff. A nest in Viroqua County where Mike Meyer had done a lot of research on loons and banded a lot of loons. And we found a loon leg up in an eagle nest. Again, an adult loon probably weighs about 9 pounds, so that thing was broken into smaller parts and then brought up to the nest. That was really uncommon. Another just kind of bounty of carp and I think suckers and teal, and then a poor little rooster from someone's farmyard. That's really
They
rare.
don't wash their dishes and clean up after themselves, do they?
No, a lot of this stuff just ends up scattered throughout the nest and then gets probably covered up a little bit the next year and just kind of decomposes in the nest. It's kind of like a big compost pile up there, really. Yeah. All right, this guy looks like a pretty nice guy, huh? He just ate his brother.
I was gonna say,
Yeah, it's called siblicide or fratricide, and I'm not sure if they know for sure whether the other eagle, they ran out of food, and either the other eaglet killed and ate it, or the parents said, I'm gonna raise one kid at least. Yeah, this one's got to go. So this was a shallow lake in Viroqua County, Man Lake. We talked to some local fishermen that were trapping bait fish out of that lake, and they said it froze solid the previous winter and wiped out almost all the panfish and stuff. And so all that was left in that lake was like minnows and little tiny fish.
So it's like that scarcity idea again, right? Because how common would you say fratricide or siblicide is?
I've probably found eagle parts in 3 nests that I can remember, where I think one of them was. Yeah, I don't know about other species of raptors or animals, but yeah, pretty scarce, pretty uncommon. But the good news is that we came back to this nest a few years later, and the crappie population had rebounded, and there were, I think, 2 or 3 chicks in the nest, same nest, same tree. Okay, so in terms of tree species that eagles like to nest in, up in the northern part of the state and where they can find them in other parts of Wisconsin, they really love white pines, and they love the tallest white pines in the area. And especially if there's some kind of deformity or broken limb at the top, I think it's easy for them to start placing sticks in the tree and start building that nest up. And they almost always need to have some kind of an open area or a window so that they can fly up and land in the nest and leave the nest easily.
So is there a pattern to how they construct the nest?
I don't know. I mean, I think they just start kind of bringing in a stick and setting it, in one crotch to another crotch, and if it stays, they'll bring in another stick and put it on top of that. They do a lot of this nest construction in the fall and winter, I think. And then, so yeah, it just starts with like a bulky sticks, and then they kind of line the top of the nest with finer material like grasses. Some eagle nests don't change at all from one year to another year, but some pairs of eagles are just compulsive nest builders. And I've got a couple slides in here that show, so some nests grow and grow and grow, and some don't change at all or hardly at all. A few in a red pine. We had one in northern Wisconsin. This was the one on, that might be the one on Man Lake, but that was really neat. You could boat right up to the base of the tree, and I think I just stepped off the boat and was able to climb up the tree, lower them down to the boat. That's a really fun nest to climb. The other really preferred or common tree species in northern Wisconsin is aspen. But those trees don't get very tall, and they often get like disease and rot in the center of them. And so if you see like those shelf mushrooms on the outside of the aspen, it probably means that there's some health issues. And sometimes we start climbing up and the whole tree just starts kind of shaking, and we don't climb that tree. And then I think similar to aspen, down in the southern part of the state, we find a lot of nests in cottonwood trees, especially along the Wisconsin and the Mississippi rivers. This was a cottonwood out on Longtail Point in Green Bay. A few nests in oak trees, and those are really nice to climb, really strong, solid, healthy tree. We've seen a couple of nests in red oaks. That was a white oak in the previous slide. There's a few live ash trees still in Wisconsin that have eagle nests in them. Most of the ash have succumbed to emerald ash borer and died and fallen over, but this was near Manitowoc this past summer. Silver maple down in the Wisconsin river bottoms. Most of those nests are fairly low because the silver maple trees just don't typically grow as tall as cottonwood do. We had one in a shagbark hickory. This was an unusually low nest. This tree was not very tall, but it was still really challenging to get up in there. We probably should have shot a line on that one, but I think I climbed it with spurs.
Can I ask, like, as far as building, like, and maturity of eagles, is like a first time builder maybe, or like as far as someone who's just not, or a bird who's not found the right tree? Like how did the low tree nest happen?
Yeah, good question. If I remember right, this was in Outagamie County, just kind of farmland. I think there's a huge dump nearby, and there just weren't a lot of really nice big tall trees in the area, and there was kind of this ditch running through the farm field that had a number of cottonwood along it, and I think they just said, this will work. And that leads me into another kind of thought, is that years ago we thought that eagles would only nest in the most remote parts of Wisconsin, and they would avoid all human activity, but we're finding them nest closer and closer to humans. I've got a picture in here later of the nest down by Second Nature Nursery down by Reedstown. It's right on the side of the highway. And so the thought is that eaglets that were raised in those nests that were near human activity, when they are ready to breed and build nests on their own, they're more likely, probably, they grew up in that situation and it didn't faze them, and so they're probably more likely to nest near a road or a house even. Yeah.
Do you know why the populations haven't recovered so much along the Great Lakes shoreline?
Oh, so, yeah, they were slower to recover in like Green Bay because of the PCBs, in Door County because of DDT. In Lake Superior, we think maybe there's another thing going on with just like limited food availability if there's a really late ice off. So they have to decide, they have to start laying their eggs in February, late February down here. It's a little bit later up in the northern part of the state, but they just have to kind of guess and hope that it's going to be a good year and the ice is going to melt and they're going to be able to get food.
Are the populations still depressed along the Great Lakes? I wasn't clear about that really.
Yeah, so we stopped doing those aerial surveys in 2018. So that's our last year of data. But just kind of anecdotally from being up there and doing work, it seems like there's still a lot of eagle nests along Lake Superior. We did have a pretty big hit, I think, from avian influenza in 2022 and 2023. And so if eagles are scavenging dead ducks that died of avian influenza, we talked to another researcher that does eagle work in Michigan, and he thought that it was really hard on their eagle population. So that maybe set them back a little bit, but yeah.
Why did you cut back on your, was it just funding, extending your time?
Yeah, I think a number of factors. One was that the project was really important early on when there weren't a lot of eagles, and then kind of their population recovered so well that they didn't need to be monitored as closely. And it was changes within the DNR. We're politically overseeing agency, and so in that realignment, it was, eagles weren't as important for the wildlife program. So we stopped doing that annual aerial survey in 2018, and boy, to pick it up now would just be almost impossible because a lot of those nests have just shifted from one side of the river to the other side, and if you don't have those observers that have been flying those routes every year, they're gonna, all the labels and the identifying territory names, everything's all mixed up. I mean, you could still fly it and count how many there are, and that would be interesting to do.
I was going to ask about the Mississippi. I know you didn't collect data there, and that's due, for next year.
Yeah.
Do we have any data, from Minnesota, DNR, anything that we'll be able to compare?
Yeah, good question. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was doing aerial surveys initially, and then I think they went to boat-based surveys, and so they have a similar data set to ours. I'm not sure if they're still surveying annually or not. And then, we might have to just contract someone to go out ahead of time and find as many active nests as they can and get GPS coordinates for us. Yeah. So some nests are low and easy to climb, and then this was that nest in Brown County. This is the first territory in Brown County, BR01. And they built their first nest, I don't remember what year it was, up in this tree, and they were those compulsive nest builders. They had to add onto it every year, and it's on the Oneida Golf Course, I think, or Brown County Golf Course. The groundskeeper said it was as big as a Volkswagen Beetle, and then the nest fell down and broke off all these branches, and then they built it in a white pine nearby. And I climbed that tree, and our other climber, Matt, climbed that tree once, and then they said they built that thing up as big as a Volkswagen, and then that fell down. And so then they built this nest way up in the top of this tree, and I had to climb it that year, and that's just that's no fun. And this was the first year the pictures tilted, but just a really thin nest. And I mean, I had to reach over the top and just kind of feel for them. We got it done. There were 3 in the nest that year, but there was a lot of pucker going on that year. In terms of tree species, this is a sycamore in Missouri that I got to climb, and I've added a new tree species to my life list. I'm pretty happy about that. So these are some of the nests where they just add on. I mean, some of them can be as tall as 8 or 10 feet. And the nest down at Second Nature is one that I have a picture of it. Yeah, so back when I had the Volkswagen, that was all the bigger that nest is. And now they've built it up probably another 5 feet. And that tree is kind of spindly looking.
So is that one pair that has done that?
Yeah, presumably, but there's a lot more drama in eagle pairs than anyone ever thought. We all thought, oh, they mate for life and happy.
Drama, for sure.
Yeah, so even this molecular analysis that our researchers are doing, if we have 3 eaglets in a nest, there might be 3 different fathers. in that same year. And so there's a lot of competition for the productive territories. So if there's an older male maybe or something, and a younger one might come in and fight with that male and kick him out of the territory. A lot of turnover. But yeah, that was up in that nest. We climbed it one year for a Natural Resources Foundation field trip.
Beautiful photo.
Yeah, oh, and then these are just some random pictures that I didn't fit anywhere else. This was Lake Dubay, County Highway O goes right through this flowage, and that guy he kind of needed a hug. And this was on my birthday. Last summer I was up on Rock Island in Door County, and we were comparing beak lengths between the eagle and myself. And my daughter, since it was my birthday, my daughter drew me a card, and she thought she was really funny. So I took the card up in the tree and took a picture. And then, don't worry, I'm bald. Yep.
I'm bald.
So then I don't know how it happened, but her favorite gnome ended up in one of the eagle nests for a picture. This is that nest in Manitowoc. This is one of the few cats. Probably, I don't know if it's a road-killed cat or something, but I can think of like maybe 2 nests that we found cats in. And you hear a lot of things on the internet about, you know, an eagle nest fell over and there were 50 cat collars in it or something. That's not happening in Wisconsin. Yeah. Oh, okay, and then so I have some, a little bit of some slides on project I'm helping a lady named Trish Miller from Massachusetts. She goes around and puts radio transmitters on eaglets before they fledge. So she wants them big. She wants them like 9 to 11 weeks old. And they put a falconry hood on them on the grounds, and then that just kind of calms them down. And so we did some work in Iowa a couple of years, and so her husband builds these transmitters, and they're about they're smaller than a stick of butter, and they're super lightweight, and they're solar powered, and they'll last for the life of the bird. They store the data. How does that work? I think they use the cellular network system, so if they're in cell range, they'll transmit a lot of data, like the temperature, how high they are, how fast they're moving, you know, their exact GPS coordinates. And then when they go way up north, they store the data on board, and then when they get back into cell coverage, they dump all the data.
Is that an institutional research project, or is it like more of a...
Yeah, so she's like a private, as far as I know. She has a company, Global Conservation, and different agencies hire her. So this was work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Iowa, and then more recently, Kansas Department of Fish and Game hired her to put transmitters on some eagles. So eagles are still kind of a novelty down in Kansas and Missouri. But those transmitters, then they get kind of preened in a little bit, and you can barely tell. Both those birds have transmitters on them. And they will stay on the bird for the life of the bird. They have a Teflon ribbon harness system that's really like excruciatingly, painstakingly measured and fitted, you know, on enough room for the bird to grow a little bit. But they're actually, eagles before they fledge are a little bit heavier than they are as an adult. So those birds all have radio transmitters on them. So some of the data from the study in Illinois, they were looking at like where do these birds go before they start breeding on their own. So we want to catch them in the nest, put transmitters on them. They spend a lot of time, you know, in that area of the nest, probably roosting in the nest at night, maybe still getting fed by their parents. And then these are the GPS tracks from some of those birds that went way up past Hudson Bay. So they spend their first 3 or 4 summers making these big trips way up north. I was going to look on the map. I don't know if that's like the Bering Sea, or I forget like what's way up there. And so summers up north, kind of winters back in the Midwest, and they won't start breeding until they're 3 or 4 years of age, maybe even a little bit older than that, depending on whether there's a good territory available. And then more recently, we put some transmitters on birds in Missouri and Iowa. One of the things they're looking at is all these big wind farms, whether that affects how eagles use an area. So we were trying to get transmitters on eaglets close to those wind farms, and we did get a few of them. They don't have like the results yet, but just interesting research that people are conducting. See again how those birds go way up north, primarily in the summer, and back down in the warmer climates in the winter. All right, so that's the end of my talk.